Welcome. My name is Patrick Curran, and along with my favorite baby boomer Greg Hancock, we make up Quantitude. We are a podcast dedicated to all things quantitative, ranging from the relevant to the completely irrelevant. In this week's episode, Greg and I explore both the challenges and the opportunities of age-period-cohort analysis when trying to understand the complexities of human behavior over time. Along the way, we also discuss bachelor night, Dave Brubeck, payphones, streetlights, global nuclear war, lazy thinking, I'm not a crook, biking to grandma's, HMS Pinafore, the Beatles, aggressive mice, trash snakes, and getting high at A-Basin. We hope you enjoy this week's episode. So I'm a bachelor this week. Kids are away at college. Andrea is out of town. I was having a lovely evening with the cats last night. I was on the couch and had a fire. We had a rare snow in Chapel Hill, so there were 3 or 4 inches of snow on the ground. I was playing Dave Brubeck. All right, little professional development, folks out there. Dave Brubeck, the album Time Out, one of the greatest albums of all time. I was making notes for our conversation this morning. For loyal listeners, you know that we often have banter at the beginning. It's not clear where we're going. Sometimes it's never clear where we're going. And then we try to pivot into the topic, sometimes more successfully than others. I'm going to show our cards in our hand right out of the gate. Okay. Today, we're going to talk about age-period-cohort analysis. We're going to talk about things like historical differences, period differences, generational differences. So I'm listening to Dave Brubeck. I got the fire going. I got a cat on my lap. And I'm thinking about recessions and pandemics and political changes. I'm jotting these things down as examples.
That's a great bachelor night.
Oh, I know how to tie one on.
Woo!
Oh, yeah. Oh, I had an herbal tea as well.
Oh, my God.
Yes.
Woo-hoo, recession.
I am 85 years old. I just want to clarify that. And I have my little blanket on me. Oh, it was bad. Without appreciating the irony, I picked up the phone and flicked on Find My iPhone. And we have this activated for all family members. My wife and I can find the kids can find us. It's not only a way of knowing where folks are if we need them, but we find that it helps us stay kind of connected. I can see that one kid is in the art studio. I can see one kid is at class or whatnot. But I glance up, and in 30 seconds, I can see exactly where each kid is and my spouse on a map in real time, and I've got one kid in Richmond, and I got one kid in LA, and I set the phone down, and I thought, that's it right there. That is the age period cohort.
Wow.
When you and I were in college, back before the horse was invented, our parents would go weeks without even hearing from us.
Oh, my gosh.
The irony made me smile, thinking about, what's a good example of a generational difference while I'm holding in the palm of my hand the real-time location of every family member.
First of all, in college, you often had to go down the hall to use the payphone to call home.
Yep.
So for your parents to call you, they'd have to call some payphone and hope to God there was some college student nearby to answer it and then go find you. It goes back even before college, of course, right? Because I think you said one time the classic line of you have to be home before the streetlights come on.
That was the family rule. During the summer, my brother and I would head out on bikes. We would have fishing rods. We'd have a backpack with a can of Pepsi and a PBJ, and we would leave in the morning. And the rule was you had to be home in the house when the streetlight came on.
And if you didn't, how are they going to find you, right? Your parents are going to hear the next morning from the authorities. But this is it, right? They're not tracking you. I remember my brother and I told my dad, it was a Saturday, I said, hey, we're going to go bike out to my grandmother's house. I was like 13 and my brother was 9. My grandmother's house was 30 miles away, and we had to bike.
That's like Lance Armstrong kind of distance.
We had to bike on a 50-mile-an-hour highway for most of the trip. And my dad's like, okay, call me when you get there. I mean, and this was fine. I mean, it was an entirely different time. I wouldn't trade it for anything. But as you're holding that in the palm of your hand, it really just makes real how fundamentally different so many things are.
We don't want to turn this into like really bad open mic night.
It is wild how different the childhood my kids are having from the one I had. My mom sent me to the grocery store. I went right up to the cashier, handed her $10 and said, my mom sent me here to buy a carton of cigarettes.
Yes, there are all these funny things that are different.
Sure.
But what we don't think so much about is how do those things form your worldview?
Yeah.
Your belief in how life operates, your cognitive schema for how you approach things. How do these different effects and generational effects literally impact the way you think about the world and operate in it? What your expectations are for yourself, for others. All of us can sit around the entire episode and just trade funny stories about what it was like. There were advertisements for pregnant women to smoke because it relaxed you.
Introducing new Virginia Slims, the slim cigarette for women only, tailored for the feminine hand.
Right? I have a really good friend who has a family picture of his dad and mom. His mom is 9 months pregnant, and his mom has a cigarette in one hand and a martini in the other. That's what we really want to talk about today is how does that imprint onto you the way that you think about the world, but then how do those imprints travel through time?
What makes me what I am in this particular moment? As Patrick alluded to, we're going to try to distill this down to 3 particular dimensions. One is age, one is period, and one is cohort, and try to talk about the very challenging interplay among those things that makes us who we are in this particular moment, and that also makes it very interesting and challenging to study people as they change over time.
This is another thing we don't do as well as we should in teaching, at least on my side of the street. Age-period-cohort analysis goes back a century, but in some areas, particularly sociology. Age-period-cohort analysis, everybody knows about. In psychology, I think if I picked a random grad student in the hallway and said, hey, in 90 seconds, can you tell me the basics of age-period-cohort analysis and what the identification problem is? I don't think many kids would be able to do that. And that's my fault because I teach longitudinal structural equation modeling and I talk about these things, but they're more oblique. I don't have an entire in-depth lecture on what this is. And so not only is it how do we puzzle these things apart, but where do we pay the reaper when we ignore them? Because I got to tell you, buddy, we ignore this all the damn time.
Oh, we ignore it and don't even necessarily know that we're ignoring it.
As we know, there are known knowns. We also know there are known unknowns, but there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know.
All right, so you're complaining about your teaching and what you're not teaching other kids.
I don't complain half as much as the students do.
That's true. So tell me about what you do teach when you're talking about longitudinal designs, and then let's figure out where all this fits in at.
So part of this is discipline specific. I'm in Department of Psychology. We more or less study measurement and change in people over time. Not universally. Dan Bauer did a PhD looking at trajectories of aggression in mice. But more or less, they're human beings. And here's where it's our fault. We're going to go into the field and we're going to collect data in wave 1, and the kids are going to be 10 to 15 years of age. And then we're going to assess them for 3 years. All right, wave 1, wave 2, wave 3, separated by 12 months. The 10-year-olds become 11 and 12. The 15-year-olds become 16 and 17. And then we say, well, wait. We don't want to analyze that by wave because our theory says what we're studying, let's say it's aggressive behavior in kids. Well, it's not when you happen to go out and get your grant and gather data. It is linked to the development of the child. Younger children, as they grow into teenagers, there are these developmental trajectories. So we teach you this parlor trick where you reorganize your data on age. So instead of having wave 1 and having 10 to 15-year-olds, we have 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds, up to 18-year-olds, right? Because 10 is the youngest in wave 1, 18 is the oldest in wave 3. And we say, isn't that freaking amazing? You only have 3 repeated assessments, but you have data on kids from age 10 to 18. This is sometimes called an accelerated longitudinal design. And it introduces missing data. The kids stop in that first cohort at age 10, 11, and 12. They don't have data at 13, 14, 15 because we didn't ask them for it.
Right.
They're in and out. They gave their 3. They're gone. The 15, 16, 17-year-olds, they didn't give data at 10, 11, and 12 because we hadn't started the study yet. Right. So that's called an accelerated longitudinal design. When we do this, we are saying all 12-year-olds are interchangeable. They're all the same. Now, some were 10, 11, 12.
Right.
Some were 11, 12, 13. Some were 12, 13, 14. All of those are interchangeable. When we teach it, we say, there are probably some ways to test that if there are really differences, but we don't need to worry about that here. And then we focus on age as a numerical variable, and we say on average, at age 10, aggressive behavior starts at this value. It increases at this rate of change as kids age per year. We fit a growth model. We bring in predictors. We have some time varying covariates, and that's the semester. So 1, we are imbuing chronological age functionally as a causal predictor, that somehow moving from 10 to 11 and 11 to 12 is causing your aggressive behavior to increase. But second, we're saying all 12-year-olds are the same, whether they were 10 when it started, 11 when it started, or 12 when it started. So that's what I teach. But holy cow, like the old Star Wars where they're in the trash compactor and the snake thing pokes its head up and goes down and pokes its head up and goes down. We know that there's some kind of snake that's going to eat us.
I had everything under control till you let us down here.
Could be worse.
It's worse.
And if you just take some of the things that you said and make it a little bit more absurd, then I think this really starts to point at some of the assumptions that we're making and the potential problems with them. In what you just described, you're saying something like, we're assuming a 12-year-old is the same whether they were measured in 2015 or 2016 or 2017. And we would probably all go, yeah, okay, that's reasonable. What if I said we measured 12-year-olds in 2018, 2019, 2020? Now, your first reaction might be, whatever, it's still 3 years in a row. But then what was going on in 2020? And how might that influence these 12-year-olds? And we obviously know about the backdrop of the pandemic, and it has wreaked havoc on all kinds of things. And so all of a sudden you're like, maybe what we're getting at is different for those 12-year-olds, even though they're still 12. When I think about doing a study on 9-year-old kids, always I get this image of my grandfather. My grandfather was orphaned at age 9. And so what did he do? Well, he went and got an apartment, learned to smoke, and went and worked on a ship. Can you imagine 9-year-olds right now doing that kind of thing? If we were comparing 9-year-olds from back when he was 9 with 9-year-olds today, we would never say that, a 9-year-old is a 9-year-old is a 9-year-old. It's hard to ignore that particular context. We ignore these little snakes that pop up in the trash compactor, but oh my goodness, they're there.
It's not that the entire field is not aware of the pandemic. We have an entire episode on that when things shut down and we were talking about what are the issues. And I've been involved with colleagues in a longitudinal project that spanned the pandemic, and we did all sorts of work putting in an extra intercept term to account for the drop in school because it was a school-based study. That's not exactly what we're talking about here. Right. You don't put a binary necessarily in was it pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, and say pandemic was statistically controlled for.
The effect of the pandemic is 6.
What we're talking about here is this imprinting on how an individual thinks about the world. You can't just have a binary predictor in to make it a mean adjustment. What does it mean for a kid who knows that it is possible that the world can shut down within a matter of weeks?
Totally.
Pre-pandemic, that was a Stephen King plotline. Post-pandemic, that can happen at any time. So how does that impact how an individual who's in that group of kids who went through that, how does that impact the way that they now as individuals navigate the world?
And so we have tried to distill these kinds of effects that make us who we are into these three categories. Those are age, period, and cohort. Who I am at a given moment, who the kid is that you're studying, can be thought of as being influenced by these three complementary forces. One is an age effect, and we know what age effects are. The idea is that I behave the way I do, I think the way I do because I am a 16-year-old kid, right? So there's something coded in to my behavior, my achievement, etc., that is a function of my age. And we often assume that as age changes, that there is some degree of continuous change in whatever outcome we might have. That idea of continuous change might be reasonable. And in fact, we model it that way in most of the things we do. Every once in a while, though, you can get these weird things popping up, like puberty, for example, or midlife crisis, whatever it might be, that's age-related. But for the most part, we assume that age is this thing that has some continuous kind of relation with whatever your outcome is. Now, period can be thought of as when we are measuring you right now. And that definitely comes into play when we're talking about measuring kids, for example, pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, pre-World War, post-World War. What is the time that we are measuring you in that particular moment? And sometimes people will assume that period effects are also continuous. Sometimes that's a little bit rougher of an assumption, right? When in any particular given year, something previously fictional now becomes some kind of reality. It's also the case that there are technological breakthroughs that happen. If you're studying learning and all of a sudden there's new technologies, right? The idea of period effects can be a little bit trickier than we might often assume. And then the last one is cohort. And there are lots of different ways of thinking about cohort. Probably the simplest way is just birth cohort. What year were you born? Patrick and I were born in different years. And then the question is, how does that add context to who you are, the way you think, the way you behave, and other things that you might possibly be studying? My grandparents, who were born in a particular year, they would save 4 green beans at the end of a meal to be able to put on the table at another time. My kids throw out platefuls of food. To what extent is that associated with when you came into the world and what forces were acting on you at that particular period in time? So we have age effects, period effects, and cohort effects, all of which come together to help shape who you are in that particular time. And let me just add this little parenthetical. We're going to talk about age as a variable, but in fact, it doesn't have to be age, right? It could be grade. It could be the number of weeks that you've been in treatment, week 1 in treatment, week 2 in treatment, week 3 in treatment. Anything that connotes the passage of time. We're just going to talk about it in the traditional way, which is age. But that also has implications for how we think about cohort, right? Cohort we typically think about as birth year, but it doesn't have to be birth year. It could be when you started into treatment, or if we're tracking kids, it could be what week you started into this particular program that we might have while you're in school. I started it on October 1st. You started it on October 8th. So we're going to talk about things in the context of age, period, cohort very traditionally, but there can be different ways of thinking about time.
And when you think about it in this way, you start to understand a little bit more about why maybe this is so important in sociology and maybe less so in psychology. Because a lot of times in psychology, we study things over weeks or months or years. Mm-hmm. And in sociology, you might study things like changes in religiosity over an 80-year period, right? That's a really interesting question. One that I find fascinating is interpersonal trust. When you look over a 60 or 80-year period, a lot of people say, oh, it's the last 10 years where all of this has come up. There have actually been decades-long decreases in institutional interpersonal trust where somebody like my dad was born in 1930. You were born with this belief of service to your country, that you would commit yourself to the betterment of others.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
I was 15 in 1980, all right? This is post-Nixon and Watergate, secret war in Cambodia. Heaven forbid you're an influential leader, because the odds are reasonably good you're going to get assassinated.
Yeah.
When you look over decades long, you darn well better be paying attention to these age and period and cohort effects. But it doesn't mean it doesn't apply to us either, because I study substance use in adolescence. In North Carolina, marijuana use is illegal. Even medical marijuana use is illegal. Welcome to the South. I go out to LA, I go to Colorado, I go to Virginia, where my family is scattered, recreational marijuana. It's legal in all three of those states. So what does it mean to a kid who is 15 and the government says, no, we're actually cool if you get high. You got to be 21, but yeah, it's the same for alcohol. But in North Carolina, they literally will not legalize marijuana for medical usages.
Well, more than 30 states have some sort of medicinal marijuana law on the books. North Carolina, however, not one of them.
So if you're studying substance use and you're looking at age effects of 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, you darn well better be paying attention to if and when marijuana became legal in the state that the kid lives.
And that's particularly relevant because there are a lot of databases out there where you say, oh, we're going to study, attitudes towards substance use or substance use itself. And if you look at the date stamp on those data, that can speak volumes about what you're going to find. And it can also greatly limit the generalizability of the results from those kinds of analyses to what the heck is going on right now.
A couple of years ago, I went back to visit my brother in Denver. We went skiing in June.
Wow.
There's a place called A-Basin, Arapahoe Basin, that's way high. I think the top of the mountain is like 10,000 feet.
Today's Color to Highlight comes from A-Basin ski areas at 12,400 feet.
We parked and we had our skis on our shoulder and we were walking through the parking lot and two guys were sitting on the bed of a truck with a bong smoking marijuana before going in to ski. We walked by and I turned to my brother and I said, oh my God, did you see that? And my brother just smiled and he was like, no, you can do that here. Even all these years later, to see somebody smoking marijuana was appalling to me.
So when we talk specifically about age period and cohort, I hope that you can see that they are inextricably tied together. And when I say inextricably, I mean mathematically, these things are functionally related. If we think of period as being the year in which we are measuring somebody, and if we define cohort specifically as the year in which a person was born, then their age is equal to whatever the year is of measurement minus their birth year. So in other words, age is equal to period minus cohort. You can imagine what kind of havoc that's going to wreak on somebody who says, we really want to try to understand the influences of age, of period, and of cohort on these outcomes that we have. How the heck are you going to do that? These are completely linearly dependent. When we have a predictor in regression, let's imagine we have a group code predictor where there are 3 groups. If you created a dummy variable for group A, group B, and group C, and you threw it in there, you know that this thing is going to blow up on you. That's why you delete that third dummy variable, so you don't have perfect collinearity. If you imagine a linear model where you put in age, and you put in period, like the year of measurement, and you put in cohort, the birth year, that thing is going to blow up because you have a perfect linear dependency here. So it is a very reasonable thing to want to understand those effects. It is a very reasonable thing to think that all of those might be influencing what it is you're interested in measuring. But untangling those things is a whole other problem.
And that's the cocktail party line you can drop if you just want to flex in front of other people and say, well, that's the identification problem. Because that's what it's been called for decades.
Yep.
Age is period minus cohort, but we all went to 3rd grade, and we can solve for one as a function of the other two no matter which two are given. So if you're given 2, you always get the third. But as Greg highlights really nicely, it doesn't mean that we're not interested in separating those effects. We would like unique estimates of those effects. Well, what is the age effect controlling for period and cohort? That is a reasonable substantive question. Mm-hmm. Go nuts. We might be interested in an interaction.
Ooh.
Maybe age has a greater impact as you're developing in some outcome if you were from this cohort than that cohort. We are not in this episode going to talk about methods of estimation. There are many ways out there. There are wonderful books on this. There are packages that do this. But I would have to say, in 50 years of trying to solve this problem, I still, in my reading of the literature, there's not a winner in how to do this, as people are still throwing things at each other as to how to try to separate these in practice.
When we say this is a fundamental identification problem, just think about that, right? When you learned a regression and you said something like, how do we interpret this slope? You would say something about, well, that's change in X1 holding X2 and X3 constant. How on earth can we study change in age while holding the current year and the birth year constant? Right? We can't do that. One can't change while holding the other constant. So we have a fundamental problem that's baked into all of this. All of the methodological approaches that are out there make assumptions. They have to make assumptions to get rid of this intrinsic problem. And so whether it's a multi-level approach that might sweep away some of the cohort issues so you don't have to think about those, or it's a partial least squares approach or an intrinsic estimator thing, every one of these kinds of approaches to deal with this has to change the problem. I think one of the things that we have to be very careful about, and that is solving the mathematical problem is not the same thing as solving the problem of understanding the effects that age and period and cohort might have, right? One is a mathematical trick. The other is trying to get at the actual influences that these things have. So I think we have to be really careful with a lot of what we might call fancy pants kinds of methods out there. Everyone makes an assumption. Not all of them are explicit, and they might really not be aligning with what's actually going on in terms of what you're interested in.
But we can treat that as a known unknown in a way, which is being aware that these things exist.
Yep.
I think that in large part because of our own teaching of the topic, we don't emphasize these issues as much as we should. I think that's part of it. But here's the other part. Even if you're not able to separate age, period, and cohort, and maybe you're in a setting where that's not of theoretical relevance, let's think a little bit for a moment about what do we even mean by an age effect?
Mm-hmm.
Let's say we're studying verbal ability and we have kids and we track them over time and they're 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 and we're studying vocabulary and we get the age of the kid and sure enough there are these age-related trajectories of verbal ability where older children have higher vocabulary than younger children. We're implicitly saying age is a causal variable in that. The reason that kids' vocabulary is going up is because they're getting older. Okay, let's get a sample of kids and let's pretend that there are no mores or ethics in our society and let's raise them in a cardboard box. All right. Now we're going to feed them. We're going to care for them.
I think in the 60s you could do studies like that, right?
Separated by a screen, the teacher would ask the learner questions in a word game and administer an electric shock when the answer was incorrect.
But we're going to do it in silence. That kid is going to have zero vocabulary. So is age a causal predictor or is age a proxy that is really, really easy for us to observe and to measure and to bring into the model? It goes back to the 70s. There was a guy named Joachim Vollhill who wrote a really nice paper on age is not a causal variable in development. Age is a proxy for all of these other things. So now generalize that to age, period, and cohort. What is age a proxy for? What is period a proxy for? What is cohort a proxy for? And start thinking about, can we build a better model by thinking about not treating these as causal factors, but as capturing things that we actually are more interested in. A term I love on this is Cliff Clogg, who is awesome and has done all sorts of wonderful things. He refers to age-period-cohort analysis as an accounting system and not a causal model. And I really love that.
It's perfect.
It is perfect. It's like we're accounting for these changes, but just given that you were born in 1930 is not a unique causal influence. That represents what?
Exactly. It represents that you are in a depression. It represents that you don't have the internet. It represents the state of where medical advances were. And I think we could say that an APC model, just generally thinking about the causal effects as age or period or cohort, I think it's lazy, right? It's easy, but it's not really getting at what the causal mechanisms are. And I think that's what's incumbent upon the researcher to do, not just to get around the identification problem, because there are lots of tricks for getting around the identification problem. It's to get at what you actually believe are the causal mechanisms at work here. So Patrick is born in 1965. 1965-ness isn't a thing. What is it about 1965 that has made Patrick who he is? God forbid, dare we ask. Is it post-assassination of Kennedy that set a political tone of what's going on? Is it a brewing war in Vietnam? Is it the Beatles coming to North America?
There are rumors around that this is Britain's revenge for the Boston Tea Party. 3,000 screaming teenagers are at New York's Kennedy Airport to greet, you guessed it, the Beatles.
I don't know what it is that made Patrick who he is, but 1965-ness isn't enough.
And here's the really interesting part in you using that as an example. In 1965, none of that had an influence on me directly because I was an infant. What it was is, what impact did that have on my parents?
Right.
In how they raised me, how they instilled values, how they parented me, what their expectations of me were to be. And it really wasn't until some coming of age as a teenager where it's 1980, Ronald Reagan, the evil empire of the Soviet Union, right? There was a legitimate worry of nuclear world war.
Every day.
Greg and I are not exaggerating on this. When we were teenagers, that was a fear that we carried with us.
Oh, yeah.
Was that there would be global nuclear war at any time.
In the background of 1983 and the level of tensions, they really were, I think, concerned that maybe the United States was getting ready to strike.
Throughout the night of the 8th of November, the entire Soviet war machine waited for the nuclear signal.
All right, now Greg and I have that imprinted in our psyche. I don't think my kids even think about a global nuclear catastrophe that you and I did.
Yeah.
But the point is that had nothing to do with the numerical value of 1,965 when I was born. It's what it represented. What we alluded to earlier is even if you can't bring numerical data to bear in your own analyses to separate one or all of these effects, to think about what are the proxies that these are for? What do they really represent? The amount of time that has elapsed since you entered the world is irrelevant as a causal variable, at least in psychosocial things that we study. But what does it represent? Is it emotional development? Is it maturation? Is it experience? Is it schooling? What is it a proxy for? And I think we can draw on an APC framework to do a better job in building subsequent causal models.
So what the heck do we do with all of this? So far, this has been an extremely curse the darkness kind of episode. I don't know that I'm going to light a very bright candle at all. I think one of the first objectives is to recognize this intertwining of age, period, and cohort. Second, to recognize that whatever method you choose, ranging from ignoring it or doing something very, very fancy, is going to have assumptions baked in. And those assumptions are things that you have to know what they are and buy into them and be able to defend them. Third point that we have to really think about what the heck age, period, and cohort represent. And honestly, if we can get at the variables that those are otherwise lazy proxies for, by all means, it would be great to get those kinds of things into the model as well. When someone is faced with longitudinal data, there certainly are things things that you can do. Again, you have to know what the limitations are. For example, oftentimes in models, we will wish away a cohort effect so that we can focus on both age and period. But under some circumstances, a cohort effect is actually testable for some types of models. And that's whether we're talking about it in the multi-level framework. Was it Miyazaki and Raudenbusch?
Yep.
Certainly in a growth modeling framework, like with accelerated longitudinal designs, we can assess whether or not there are statistically significant cohort differences in some of the key aspects of our model. And if there aren't, then we might feel a little bit more confident in saying that cohort is irrelevant. But if there are, then trying to understand why. Why is it that cohort is somehow interacting with these other processes that are operating?
So it's interesting because you said it's a curse the darkness kind of thing. I honestly don't feel that way.
Okay.
I feel like this is an opportunity. It is really cool to think about, wait a minute, what is this La Brea tar pit of causal influences as an individual navigates time? And we're so focused on chronological age. And again, it's easy.
Yeah.
And quite honestly, you use the term, and I really like it, it's kind of lazy thinking, right? You can ask a 2-year-old, so how many years do you have? And they hold up 2 fingers, and we know what age is, and we can get a measurement of it, and we can bring it into the model. But I think this is a really wonderful intellectual goose, both with age, to say, but wait a minute, this is not causing an increase in aggressive behavior. This is not causing your math ability to go up. This is correlated with all the really cool things that are causing it. And if you do a thought experiment, you can say one of our goals as longitudinal researchers is to make chronological age irrelevant in our model, right? If you think about it, if it's a proxy for other things and we're able to identify and measure those proxies that are truly the underlying causal mechanism, we don't need age.
Right.
Maybe it's social development, maybe it's emotional development, then age becomes irrelevant. That's within age alone, but then in thinking about, well, wait a minute, depending upon the design and the outcome and the sample that we have, if we're looking at interpersonal trust over time, when were these people born?
That in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
Because my dad had an inherent trust in the government up until the Vietnam War. He was all about service, all about volunteering, all about public duty.
I said I feel a sense of duty.
What, did you just walk out of the Pirates of Penzance? Well, he's an Englishman.
He is an Englishman, is from HMS Pinafore.
Don't tell me about Gilbert and Sullivan. See, one of the ones about duty.
They're all about duty.
And mine, when I kind of came of political awareness, I didn't believe anything anybody had to say.
Reagan denied the allegations that he had negotiated with terrorists. But Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North came forward and acknowledged that he diverted funds to the Contras. North also said Reagan knew about it.
And my kids are just disgusted by the entire process.
Yeah.
So thinking about what can we do with this conceptually? What can we do with this empirically? We often work with data where you can compute the cohort, you can make it a between subjects predictor, and you can bring it into the model. That's what Miyazaki did. Make it a testable hypothesis.
Yes.
If there are no cohort differences, maybe you can dispense with it. If there are under assumptions, maybe you can control for that in varying degrees. Also to think about things like, wow, I wonder when I'm gathering data, or if I'm using a big public access data set on marijuana, that I want to look at other data to say, was this assessment taken in Colorado before marijuana was legal or after marijuana was legal?
Right.
Because you damn well better put that in if you're looking at marijuana use, because the very way a kid thinks about marijuana, if it's illegal versus legal, is going to change the day that they make that legal.
And so in the end, like just about everything we talk about, it's about getting the closest you can to fidelity between the processes you think are operating and the model it is that you're analyzing. And whether that means creating cohorts that are not just year cohorts, but rather groups of things, because I bet Patrick's dad, who was born in 1930, didn't think all that differently from people who were born in 31 or 32 or 33, right? Oftentimes when we define these cohorts or periods in ways that are actually meaningful to us, when we pull in the variables that they are otherwise proxies for, we can get a little bit closer to understanding the processes that we're interested in.
But here's what's funny, and I've teased Greg about this before. Greg is a baby boomer, and I am not. And I missed being a baby boomer by 9 weeks. But by rule of engagement, I get to say to Greg, okay, boomer.
God, I hate that.
That's right. I did that. Me. Because I'm a baby boomer. I believe anything anyone ever tells me.
So thank you, everybody. As always, we so appreciate you sharing your time with us.
I'm not a boomer.
Okay, boomer.
I'm not a boomer. Thanks so much for joining us. Don't forget to tell your friends to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever they go for things they can only stand to listen to periodically. You can also follow us on X, Blue Sky, or Instagram, and visit our website, quantitudepod.org, where you can leave us a message, find organized playlists and show notes and syllabi, search for past episodes, and other fun stuff. And finally, get cool Quantitude merch, like shirts, mugs, stickers, and spiral notebooks, from redbubble.com, where all proceeds from non-bootleg authorized Quantitude Pod merch go to donorschoose.org to help support low-income schools. You've been listening to Quantitude, the podcast whose humor has no age, period, or cohort effects whatsoever, possibly because everyone finds us equally unfunny. Speaking of age, period, and cohort effects, Patrick recently found recordings from the University of North Carolina Thurstone Lab security system, going from all the way back in the 1940s up till today. Let's take a listen to a few snippets. Why, I think my dissertation is going to turn out real swell. I've written a simulation using a Fortran program on the vacuum tube mainframe computer. Each individual replication only takes 3.5 hours. Hey man, it took a while, but I think I have my groovy simulation study all coded on these punch cards and ready to go over to the data processing center. If you could just help me carry these boxes. Oh no! Oh! Dude, I'm gonna run my simulation from my desktop computer and make executive batch calls into the university's Unix system using my modem. I just have to monitor it continuously for the next, well, like 6 months or so. Oh, crap. Hey, Siri?
Yes? How may I help you?
Have ChatGPT generate a simulation I can use for my dissertation?
Sure, I'd be happy to. What journal would you like me to submit it to?
Bruh, do I have to do everything? This is most definitely not NPR.